Welcome to the Resilience series. I'm Stephanie Weaver, the author of the Migraine Relief Plan and the upcoming Migraine Relief Plan cookbook. And for that project, I'm interviewing a variety of people on the topic of resilience. My guest today is Dr. Margaret Slavin. Dr. Slavin is an associate professor of nutrition and food studies at George Mason University, a food scientist, and a registered dietitian. Welcome, Dr. Slavin.
Thank you. It's a delight to be here and to talk to you and be part of this series.
Great. Many people watching may not be familiar with the work of food scientists and registered dietitians. Can you start by explaining what both of those things are for us?
Absolutely. Happy to. So, a food scientist is someone who's trained to study food through the lenses of the various sciences that you're already familiar with. So chemistry, biology, physics, engineering, all applied to food. And we have subspecializations within food science kind of in those categories. So food microbiologists would be those who study bacteria and other microbes in foods, how foods may come to be contaminated with them, and ultimately how to prevent such contamination and to prevent foodborne illness from happening. My training in my PhD focused on food chemistry, so the chemical analysis of foods, using techniques to measure different amounts of nutrients present in foods, but other components of interest to health too. So things like phytochemicals, antioxidants, the different categories of dietary fiber. And so I've used those techniques to investigate also how food processing could impact or preserve some of the nutritional components of a food during processing. Um, I was a registered dietitian before I was a food scientist. So everything I do in food science is impacted by my kind of overwhelming appreciation of nutrition. RDs are the credentialed nutrition professionals in healthcare. We also work in the community and public health settings and in food service like school lunches. And we go through a credentialing process, much like any of the other allied health professions to earn the RD credential. Um, but I'll be honest, but I had migraine before I was in either of those two professions. So it's been somewhat of a personal quest to get involved with dietary migraine research professionally.
Well, I'm sorry that you experienced migraine disease, but we're really glad to have you on board helping with this very important thing. So, we're recording this at the beginning of 2021. What do we know right now about the relationship between nutrition and migraine disease?
It's tough. We know both a lot and a little. We know a lot in the sense that there is some relationship between food or nutrition and migraine disease. This comes from a variety of places: clinical experience, anecdotal experience, and kind of this general trend, if you read the literature, of research publications relating diet to migraine. That when people with migraine disease make changes to their diets or do things that influence their nutrition, there often seems to be an impact on migraine outcomes. But when you really go into the scientific literature, you try to dive in and zoom in on really understand the specifics. Um, this is where we definitively know relatively little, and that there is not great evidence for any specific diet and migraine intervention, in the sense of evidence-based medicine or evidence-based nutrition that we like to rely on for clinical practice.
And why do we know so little? Tell us what the issues are.
Mm. A lot. Okay. So let's see. So in research, we use the concept of variables to design our studies to try to understand these questions. So in clinical research, a variable is any trait of a person or their environment, that could change or vary, and therefore it's variable. The cleanest studies, the ones that are most favored in modern evidence-based practice, are those where we change a single variable at a time and observe for any changes in the outcome variable. So if we want to study the impact of a dietary supplement on migraine or a migraine outcome, we provide a dietary supplement, and this is the variable, the one variable we control: who gets the supplement and who gets a placebo. And then we measure the impact of that on some migraine outcomes, such as the days of migraine per month after they've been taking this supplement or placebo for some set period of time. And we would hope to see the number of people who received the supplement had decreases in the number of migraine days as compared to the people getting the placebo. That's a nice study. It's a clean comparison, and it's possible to do with things like dietary supplements and drugs. And you can so cleanly divide them into these variables. You're either taking it or you're not. Now, let's think about diet and what it means to do a study with a true dietary change. Even so, can we use the example of a low carb diet? I don't mean it to be as sort of any endorsement, but just kind of as an example. If we want to do a study of whether a low carb diet might help people with migraine, if we transition folks in our treatment group to a low carb diet, we're changing a lot of things all at once. We're changing not only just carbs in general, but the types of carbs. So we're talking sugars, the simple carbohydrates that you would find in sodas and sugar sweetened beverages, complex carbohydrates like what you would starches and fibers in grains, even what we in the nutrition world consider kind of the healthy carbohydrates. The more complex carbohydrates, you're reducing those. And when you take carbohydrates out of the diet, you've got to replace them with something else, some other calorie contributing nutrient. So you're increasing fats, you're increasing proteins, or one or the other, or both. And when you do that, you're not just changing the nutrients, you're changing the foods that carry those nutrients. So that's going to inherently change the vitamins and minerals and all the other, components of food that travel in those foods. And so you're making all of these changes to the diet all at once. Not only that, the person knows they're making the changes. It's really hard to do a blinded dietary study. So they know that they're probably supposed to hopefully be feeling better if they make these changes. They're in contact with a research team that's hopefully helping them to follow this diet. And there's a question of how closely people are actually adhering to the diet. As researchers, we don't know. And we have to measure that. So all of these things are in contention as potential variables when we're trying to study diet. So it's much more difficult to do a clean diet study to observe the influence of the diet, on top of the fact that it's difficult to do migraine research and pain research generally, because of all the different things that we know could impact migraine: stress, hormones, weather, genetics, exercise, you name it. So it can be difficult to tease out whether what you're doing is related to your diet intervention or something else that's happening in the background of people's lives. So
Yeah, and a couple of things to think about as well are migraine, the pain. How are you gauging impact? Like, it's all self-reported by the patient, right? So
mhm,
it's, I guess you'd have a baseline of a month of that person's, migraine experience, and then you're measuring it against their baseline. But how do you
mhm,
compare patient X with patient Y in terms of, if they are saying I had 6 days where I was at a number 8 on the migraine scale, what does that mean compared to the other person? So that was a great general descriptor of the challenges that you all face. The other thing is these studies are extremely expensive to run, are they not? And the more people you have in them, the more expensive they are. So generally, they're not very large groups of people. Uh,
yes,
they're also not necessarily run for as long as, like ideally you might want to run a study for 6 months with 10,000 people, but what you're going to really be able to do is 4 weeks with 800 people or 100 people. And
yeah.
and there's ways that scientists uh, factor that in with, how the studies are designed and how the participants are chosen, but it is very challenging. And then the last thing I'll say is that who funds studies like that?
Oh, I wish I wish I knew. Um, to foundations tend to be. I mean, there are some federal sources, but it's a challenge to to compete for funding for these types of studies. And I understand that. On some level, we can understand that it's difficult to convince funders to pay for research that, I've just listed a laundry list of why this research is difficult to do. And it's expensive, as you mentioned, because there are so many things that vary in these studies. That's the exact reason we need more participants in the studies to be able to control for it statistically. And so that does rack up the cost. And yet, it's not a sure thing when the research is all said and done that we would have, something that, yes, this absolutely is something that we can use to improve patient care. So it's a difficult sell at the moment.
Sure. Yeah, and the other thing that I'll just point out is that pharmaceutical studies are funded because at the end of the road, the expectation is, well, we're going to be able to pay for all that research that we did by selling this drug. And when you finish a nutrition study and you say, yay, a low carb diet really does help with migraines, or whatever you were testing,
Mhm.
vegetarian or Mediterranean or
Yeah.
whatever that might be, there's no place someone goes to then make a bunch of money on that to help pay for that study. So there's
Mhm.
a number of factors, and I really appreciate you sort of illuminating this. And I do talk about this a bit in my book, why it is so challenging to study nutrition. It's because you could say, okay, we're going to have 24 people and we're going to provide all their meals for 2 weeks,
Yes.
and then exactly what they ate as long as they didn't stop at fast food. um, but then you're adding in all these unknown factors of, well, but that's not their normal experience to have 3 meals a day showing up on their doorstep that they're supposed to eat, or if you lock
Mhm.
them in a lab for 2 weeks, I mean, that just, all of those things confound what you're trying to study. So
Exactly.
that is challenging. Okay. So you're trained as a bench scientist, meaning that your research primarily happens in a lab and not a clinic. So what kinds of questions are you trying to answer right now in your research? Tell us about that.
Okay. So, kind of in recognition of all these limitations that we've been talking about with clinical nutrition research, I'm trying to build a research program to look at the question of diet and migraine from a mechanistic perspective. So, trying to understand how diet, or really how elements of the diet, may influence specific physiological processes known to be involved in migraine. You may have heard of CGRP at this point. I don't know if you talk about that elsewhere in the
Yeah,
series.
remind everybody what it is, because I'm sure there's people watching who have no idea what it is. I do, but
Absolutely.
yeah.
Okay, of course. So CGRP, calcitonin gene-related peptide, is a peptide. It's a signaling molecule in our bodies that is used as part of the migraine inflammatory response. And it's known through lots of evidence that CGRP is elevated during a migraine attack as part of that inflammatory response. It's elevated between attacks for people with chronic migraine too. And as a result, it's also the target of a new class of pharmaceutical treatments, these antibodies that target CGRP and essentially stop the signaling process from happening. And so this is one of the ways I think nutrition research can sort of piggyback on some of the pharma research that's been done to, to be able, maybe a little more effective and with the resources we do have in nutrition. I've done a cell-based assay in the lab where we demonstrated that grape extracts and ginger extracts could decrease the secretion of CGRP from cells, neuronal-like cells in the lab. So you asked, what are the questions? The next question is whether or not these foods, ginger, grape, or something else, could decrease CGRP on a whole organism level after consuming a food and kind of going through the normal digestion, absorption, and metabolism processes, and instead of isolated cells on a dish. So that's one thing, one question we're pursuing. Another one I'm really excited about is a study. I have some trial funding to use functional MRI to study food triggers and migraine. And so fMRI allows us to observe activation in different regions of the brain while someone is in the scanner and then being asked to perform a task. We can observe what part of the brain is working to support that task. And we're hoping to observe people's responses to images of their personal food triggers while they're in an fMRI. And eventually, maybe we'll get to even actual exposure to their food trigger while they're in the fMRI, which would be exciting. And so we're trying to do this to observe what's happening in the brain and to tease out different ways that foods may be involved in triggering a migraine.
That's so exciting. And for a study like that, are those volunteers that participate, or do they
Yes.
have to? Okay, so they don't, it's not a randomized situation in that case. It's you're asking for people between the ages of X and Y who experience migraine, and you probably have some other things that are on the list, but then anybody who volunteers, you sign them up, right? Essentially.
Yeah. So this is, again, this is a trial study. So we're still early in the process. This is volunteer. We're not doing any sort of treatment. We're just trying to observe and learn um, from people who do have migraine. Yes, we're looking at adults. We're looking at people with migraine. I believe at least 4 migraine days a month, and people who self-report having food triggers, to at least one food trigger from kind of the common list of food triggers of migraine: caffeine, alcohol, and chocolate, unfortunately,
Yeah.
and some others.
So mine are like you would need to show me pictures of kombucha
Mm,
and it's like really like good Swiss cheese or brie. Oh
mm,
my gosh, I would
okay.
love to know what my brain does looking at looking at brie in the fMRI because I'm sure my
Yeah,
brain would be like, "Oh, that's delicious, and I should not have that." And so it's fascinating. Okay,
yeah.
so I wanted you to go over all that because I think for those people that aren't have really kind of no idea like what scientific research is about and you see like a headline and you think, well, didn't I just hear last week that coffee was good for migraines and now they're saying it's bad for migraines? I wanted people to understand kind of all the nuances of what goes on. So how does this sort of research that you're doing, which is pretty abstract and very specific at the moment, how does that help patients in the long term?
Okay, good. Very good question. So I'm trying to think. So there's something they sort of drill into you in an evidence-based nutrition training is the pyramid of evidence-based research, and at the base of it is these um, basic science studies, things we do in the lab: cell culture assays, animal assays, and you work your way up through kind of observational studies where we observe what's happening in the population, and even higher you get to those randomized controlled trials we were talking about. And so kind of the pinnacle of evidence-based research is that, having multiple randomized controlled trials where we can um, hopefully they're agreeing and finding that some particular dietary intervention is showing consistently that it improves migraine outcomes. But to get there, to know what to study, you've got to start at the base, and you've got to start with, you know, why do we think this is happening? Observations in society where people think these things trigger their migraine. Okay, let's look into that. Let's try to figure out, does it? Why does it? Why might this be happening? And kind of do all of these studies at the base of the pyramid of evidence to help us understand why and how, in order to design the next study for that next level of evidence, so that when we get to the point of being able to do more randomized controlled trials where we can justify it to say, give us this large amount of money to study this question, we've got a good reason to say why we think this is the diet to study. This is the food that we think is most consequential for this disease, or food pattern. Um, so
Yeah,
we
that was
really
great.
can justify it.
Yeah, and just an example, I was trying to think of an example that people might be really familiar with. So, the Mediterranean diet
Mhm.
started as observational studies, right?
Yeah.
There was a
Oh,
lot
absolutely.
of evidence that people were living very long in some of these areas in the Mediterranean, and they didn't have heart
Hmm.
disease, and they didn't have some of the what are called the diseases of Western civilization, heart disease and hypertension and diabetes and obesity. And so then that went into, well, what is it about that diet? Is it the olive oil? So then there were olive oil studies where they were just looking at what's in
Hmm.
olive oil. Is it that? Is it the whole grains? Is it the very little meat? Is it because they're eating fish every day? And so,
Hmm.
and then, as consumers, we've all seen those headlines, and then we've seen the diet books, right, have come out about eat this way, because so you can kind of see how it filters in. And so your type of study maybe would be, you would put people in an fMRI and show them pictures of olive oil versus, canola oil, and see if they have I mean, that's a silly example, but I think
Yeah,
it does.
it's surprisingly difficult to find pictures that
Oh yeah.
clearly indicate which is which.
It's true. This is true. That was a very poor example. But maybe
No,
a cell assay maybe would be where they were
mhm,
studying specifics of the Mediterranean, components of that diet, to try to figure out, well, can we make a supplement about this? And then it turns
mhm,
out that no, it's really the whole lifestyle. It's really the whole foods and the walking
mhm,
and the being in community, and yeah.
mhm.
Okay, great. Well, I think that's
Yeah.
helpful, so people kind of have a broader understanding. So if you're watching us, the next time you see a nutrition related headline, you can think about, I wonder where that is in the pyramid that Dr. Slavin was talking about. And I wonder how many studies they have. Is that one study? Is it, were there
Mhm.
24 people in it? Were there 5,000 people in it? And that helps us as consumers to be more critical in a positive way about whether we're going to make our changes based on what we're reading in headlines. Okay.
Yeah, and I think if I could add one
Yeah,
thing
of
to
course.
that, just to kind of go a little deeper, just at that base of the pyramid that I was talking about, just the cell studies, the animal studies. Many times, what we see in a cell study or an animal study does not translate to the human studies, to randomized controlled trials. And so this is, you mentioned earlier, things like, is caffeine a trigger, or kind of the common punching bag in nutrition is the egg. Is, should we be, are eggs nutritious or not? It goes back and forth depending on which headline you read. And a lot of that has to do with these individual studies way down at the bottom of the pyramid, where news cycles will pick up on a single study, and that's not the whole story, and that's not what we can make nutritional recommendations on. It's an important piece of the puzzle, but it's one piece, and you can't see the whole picture based on that. So
That's so helpful. So, what gives you hope about dietary migraine research for the future?
a sip of water. um, a lot of things give me hope, for dietary migraine research. I think there's a broader interest in it than I've seen previously. At the moment, I see more publications on the topic these days coming from all corners of the world, really, doing higher quality research on diet and migraine. So it's happening. It's slow, but it's happening. Um, I'm very encouraged by the interest and support from migraine advocacy groups and individuals who are asking for this sort of evidence and support in achieving their own dietary goals. And so I think that's a critical piece of the puzzle too, in helping us move this forward, is saying, it's not just the scientist in a lab somewhere working with cells. It's, real people want this and want these answers to be able to make these decisions and these changes for themselves. And I've seen a greater interest in clinicians who are treating migraine, and goodness knows they've got enough to cover with their patients. So I'm hopeful that as we accumulate more nutrition evidence, that will translate into more clinical nutrition professionals joining these care teams, and supporting patients in a way that we haven't seen in the past. So those reasons, in addition to, for the research itself, it's really encouraging. There are advances in migraine research all the time. And as I mentioned before, I think, as pharma is learning to developing different research techniques to study medicines, we can borrow some of those techniques and research in nutrition to move trials forward. And nutrition research is also moving forward at a rapid pace. A flurry of research is happening on the microbiome, this microbial ecosystem we've got growing in our guts, which interacts with our entire bodies, including the brain, hardwired to the nervous system, and more indirectly, chemical messengers in the blood. So, it's one of those things that's it's incredibly humbling as a scientist that so much of our health and well-being is tied to these little microbes, and yet we've all but neglected them for until relatively recently. So tying improvements in our understanding of the microbiome to migraine, I think, has a lot of potential to be big and fascinating. But there are other nutrition techniques in research that I think will be crucial for moving us forward. Um, Techniques that we're using in personalized nutrition, similar to what's being used in personalized medicine. So a lot of the omics techniques, genomics, proteomics, metabolomics. I think advances in these techniques mean that it will be possible to do research on diet and migraine that maybe is outside of the realm of what we've been talking about, those randomized controlled trials. That kind of one way to do evidence-based practice and building that evidence. So I think all of this told, I think there's a lot of room for hope in this space, but it's going to take some time for kind of the research community to fully realize the opportunities, and then we've got to eat in the meanwhile. So
Perfect segue. How can dietary choices impact the experience of migraine disease?
oh gosh, um, I have to, how can I say? Hmm. I'll say what I know, and some of this, like as I mentioned, the evidence isn't perfect in this space. So there have been a handful of studies that have attempted to look at dietary interventions, meaning they actually change what people eat, and most of them have shown some promise in reducing symptoms of migraine. Even across a different variety of interventions, from low fat to low carb and ketogenic, and some others, vegetarian. Um, I think maybe there are a couple different ways to think about how food may influence migraine. Foods might trigger the migraine process directly in a number of ways. Think it, what we commonly think of as a migraine trigger. And so I don't want to use the word, but like flipping a switch almost so quickly, causing some sort of cascade in the body to produce that migraine response. But there's also, I think, when we talk more broadly about food patterns, we can also talk more broadly about the potential for diet to sort of indirectly influence the body's overall state of being, the overall state of inflammation, for example, or the overall composition and function of the microbial species in the gut, in the microbiome. So that tends to be, it's a more gradual process. It's not as, for better or worse, not as dramatic as something like what we think of as a more kind of classical migraine trigger, but the overall patterns may influence, for example, the state of inflammation.
Great. So just to be a tiny bit more, I'm going to pin you down just a little bit
Of
more than
course,
that.
yeah.
So if we want to reduce, so the things that we'd be looking to are reduce inflammation and support gut health. So what are some sort of general best practices? Now put your RD hat back on and tell us what
Yes,
those best practices are.
got it. Yeah. Again, I'm speaking in generalities because we don't, as unfortunately keep having to reiterate, we don't have great evidence as a whole for saying that if you do these things, you will most certainly reduce your migraine. And I wish I could say that, but I can't. So generally, if we're looking at a diet to reduce inflammation, or to promote a healthy microbiome as we understand it, there's a lot of overlap between those two, thankfully. And again, we can talk in terms of food patterns rather than a whole lot of individual foods. So generally, I think the good news is that it's generally aligned with what we've been talking about as a healthy diet in the US dietary guidelines for a while. So things like lots of fruits and vegetables. So for most people, it means trying to increase your fruit and vegetable intake. We say kind of as a general guideline, half of your plate at meals should be composed of fruits and vegetables. Other food groups, so relying mostly on plant proteins, beans, nuts, and seeds is a good way to a good part of a diet that can lower inflammation. And sort of on the flip side of that, if you're relying on plant proteins for your protein sources, that sort of necessarily means decreasing intake in either red meats, processed meats, or other animal proteins. Fish, however, fish being a good source of omega-3 fatty acids, a key, the chemist in my head going back to the anti-inflammatory properties of the omega-3s, fish is a good source of those if you choose to eat fish. So again, upping your fruits and vegetable consumption, relying a lot on plant proteins, and increasing fish consumption. And in the process of this and making those choices, as well as relying on whole grains for the types of grains that you do consume, a lot of this is increasing your dietary fiber consumption, which is and kind of a variety of different sources of dietary fiber, which is going to keep the microbes in your gut pretty happy. And I would say, so that's the positive side, things to try to increase. We also look at things to try to decrease. And so in an anti-inflammatory diet, you'd be looking to decrease sugar intake, simple sugar intake from any variety of sources, sugar sweetened beverages, snacks, baked goods, that sort of thing, as well as hyper processed foods, trying to avoid an over reliance on hyper processed foods. And this is where the food scientist in me has to step out a little bit and say some amount of processing is okay. You know, flour is technically a processed food. We need processed foods in our lives to have shelf stable foods. It's okay to eat frozen foods and processed foods, canned foods, and so forth. But it's trying to avoid an over reliance on them as a main component of your diet, and just finding the balance that's right for you, where okay, sometimes you do need a prepackaged bar to get you through your day. That's fine. But trying to make those choices where you can.
That's great. One kind of rule of thumb that people can follow is would your grandparent or great grandparent recognize the food? Because if the answer is no, like it's in a crinkly package and it's a chip covered with some sort of flavor or dust, that is kind of a good indicator. Also, foods that are advertised on television tend to be in that highly processed category because they make a lot of money on them, so then they can afford to run commercials on them. So if it's
Mhm.
advertised during the Super Bowl, very possibly not a great choice on a regular basis. So those are just some rules
Yeah.
of thumb. And that was very helpful. So thank you. And I think that what you did was you put those things that we've all heard many, many times about what we should eat into a context that I think was really helpful because, one of the things is if you start just making conscious choices to fill up half, or I often try for 3/4 of my plate to be vegetables,
Even better. Yeah.
it pushes those other foods like out of your grocery budget. It pushes those other foods just like you're not spending time cooking them. I mean, most people are cooking a lot more than they probably ever thought they would since the beginning of 2020. And
Yeah.
so just kind of making those decisions starts to gradually shift those habits. Okay, my
Mhm.
last question. What are
Okay.
some self care resilience strategies that you find most helpful, and how do you think of nutrition playing into the concept of resilience?
Mm, good question. I think just if I'm being, I have to admit, it's easier for me personally to talk about the facts and the science than it is to, it's harder for me to maybe personally share. But But what I have done, as I mentioned, I've had migraine. It's been a couple decades at this point. um, Diet is a piece of it, but it's by far not the only thing. I think it's been a journey figuring this out for me, like for anyone else with migraine. And I sort of for years toyed with the idea of taking a mindfulness based stress reduction class. And just shortly before the pandemic, I finally did it in the fall of 2019, took an MBSR class. And that was a huge, game changer in my world. Um, I think it's fair to say it changed, it was life changing, in terms of just my outlook, managing my stress. I really find mindfulness meditation, and especially the mindful pausing that you do, that I have learned to do throughout the day, to really check in with how I'm doing. And it's been eye opening, to kind of learn how I'm doing, moment by moment, and when I need to take a moment, and when I need, when I realize, oh, all these things about food that I think about constantly, and then I find myself in a moment of, oh, it's been 5 hours since you had something to eat, or you're really dehydrated, Margaret. Take a break. Um, so it's been eye opening in that sense. So it's certainly not just diet for me. There have to be these other components to it. Um, these days, I've sought out. You had to be much more intentional seeking those sources of kind of personal support from elsewhere in my community. I have set kind of walking dates with friends, regular walking dates that I look forward to very, very much, to talk and and have that sense of community. And when I say walking, on the phone, we walk independently at the different places, with our earbuds in. But to have that sense of community. I talk to health professionals, including people with nutrition expertise. It's not just about knowing the science. I think, as you know so well, it's having the tools and the life skills to actually apply this to your own life, and the support and the motivation, and the means to do it. So it's finding the right support structures has been important for me, and find and sort of recognizing that at different times in my life I need different supports. I need different, um, interventions. Sometimes it's diet, sometimes I've got to really focus on exercise more. Sometimes, now building meditation into the mix. So I think it's that, I'm a work in progress. And for me, I think embracing that outlook of, it's going to change from time to time, and I need to, just keep reinvesting in me. That's been crucial.
That was a fantastic answer. Dr. Slavin, thank you again for being here today and sharing your knowledge with us. Please follow her on Twitter, Margaret_Slavin, to learn more about her work and her research. And check out other episodes of the Resilience series on Facebook Watch, IGTV, and YouTube. Follow me at SWeaverMPH to learn more about my upcoming book, which is due out in spring of 2022 from Surrey Books. Thanks so much for watching.